G'day, Charlie Mgee here on behalf of Permaculture Australia, and I'm speaking today with Lynne Kelly, who is the author of many books, but among which are The Memory Code and Memory Craft, which are two excellent books that explore the different ancient ways of cultural encoding and memory techniques used by traditional cultures around the world. I read these books a couple of years ago, and well, The Memory Code, her first book, and it blew my mind. And we're going to have a little bit of a chat today about some different ways that maybe permaculture can, have relevance in all of this, because I'm really intrigued by this. And so I'd just like to say welcome to Lynne Kelly.
Thank you. Great to be here, Charlie.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And now I know we're both in isolation still, but we are both currently on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and I think it's fitting to have an acknowledgement, even in this virtual space, of the land that we both are on. And so I'm currently in Jara country, which was never ceded. And, it's good to acknowledge these things because the people here have a huge role to play, or have had a huge role to play over history of these, building these traditional memory crafts. And your quote in your book, The Memory Code, I think, is that in the past, the elders had encyclopedic memories and could name all of the animals and plants across the landscape and the stars in the sky too. Yet most of us struggle to memorize more than a short poem. And I'm just interested, Lynne, using traditional Aboriginal Australian songlines as the key, you've identified the powerful memory techniques used by Indigenous people around the world. Can you tell us how you started in this really unique work of yours and some of the examples that you've come across?
Well, I was blessed with an incredibly bad memory, and all my life it's been a problem, but until I stumbled across this stuff, because I was looking at animal behavior. I'd written a book on spiders, my great love, spiders, but more important, I'd just written a book on crocodiles. And in order to name all the crocodiles around the 23 crocodilian species around the world, I tried to find some nice one. I thought, I'll use the cutesy little stories from Indigenous cultures. I am horrified by how ignorant I was. And in doing that research, I started to realize these weren't cutesy little stories at all. They were encoding vast amounts of detailed biology of the behavior and everything else to do with these animals. And so I proposed a new book to my publisher, Alan Unwin, about looking at animal behavior and animal stories in terms of the Indigenous stories and whether I would know more. I keep hesitating because you acknowledge Dja Dja Wurrung, and they have been hugely helpful to me. And the local elders have asked me to use the term teachings. We use the term stories more commonly, but they are in fact teachings. And this is what I discovered. So I proposed to write a book about animal behavior, and would I see more in the wildlife and the animals and plants and everything if I knew the Indigenous stories, which of course I did. Lovely book on its way, which never happened, by the way, if you're trying to work out how come you haven't ever heard of this book. Because I derailed. I got a PhD scholarship to do this research, and I derailed the whole thing because I realized they were memorizing vast amounts of information. Every insect, every plant, thousands of them, the skies, lots of things we'll talk about, and I couldn't remember anything. And so my question became, how the hell are they doing this? And that changed my whole PhD, my books, my life completely.
What are some of the most interesting experiences you had when you started delving into this? I know you traveled the world for a while and kind of started really going into it. What are some of the first encounters you had, and what was your experience around that?
It's actually interesting at the beginning because there is a group of experts, and I use that term with inverted commas, on Aboriginal culture who are not Aboriginal. And they were telling me, you may not talk about science in terms of Indigenous cultures because science is a Western construct, right? And they don't do science. So I was being very careful what I was saying. When I met First Elder right at the beginning, I was at the Koori Heritage Trust, and he asked me, what are you here working on? And I sort of said, well, I'm looking into the, and he said, oh, out with it, woman. I said, look, I'm investigating the role of science in Indigenous knowledge systems and how they encode so much science. He said, well, we've been trying to tell you that for years. And so I learned to only ask Indigenous people what language to use, and to try always to use their language, their terms. There are no equivalents in English to the ancestors, the old people, the Kachina for the Pueblo, whatever that term is. And I found that religious terms are used constantly. I was looking at the archaeology as well of ancient cultures. They're always referred to as temples, and you never get Indigenous cultures talking that way. So mostly in my travels, I was looking at the archaeology because I could see the signs of songlines and all the rest in the archaeology. And I think I better explain exactly how songlines work from this perspective. But I also worked with a Pueblo in southwest of the United States. And so that's because they are a farming group. And that gave me the contrasts between the various Australian cultures who are not nomadic, haven't been for 10,000 years. They are mobile, move between locations and resources, or farming, or in New Guinea it's called gardening. It's too grey to make.
Yeah, the concept of farming is really being redefined now in a lot of books, such as Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu and things like that, isn't it? And even in the permaculture realm, I guess permaculture itself is sort of an attempt to try and bridge that divide between the Western way of thinking and something that more resembles a traditional culture. One of the permaculture principles is observe and interact, which includes making decisions based around observing seasonal changes and microclimates and sun and wind patterns and reading the landscape, which of course is something that traditional cultures have often done just as part of regular life.
Always done.
Can you tell us of some examples where memory codes have been used to keep track of harvest times and seasons and things like that in different parts of the world, or even in this part of the world?
Yes.
You mentioned the Pueblo before.
Yes, I'll talk about the Pueblo because in terms of farming, their stories, and we're talking about corn in particular. The Pueblo are in the southwest of the United States, New Mexico mostly, and they are dependent on corn, and they have 7 different major colours of corn, and then, as you will all know, it cross-pollinates like you wouldn't believe. Now, the Pueblo have kept their corn crops, the 7 different colours and sub-varieties, that looks like about 17 sub-varieties, absolutely pure for hundreds of years. And they've done this using memory systems. So the memory systems I'm going to talk about include song, story, dance. They are the performance ones. Mythology is a memory device. And I'll get to that in detail because that's the really big one in the corn case. But they are teachings. They are ways of knowing stuff, because song is much more memorable than straight prose, as you know, when you get the song stuck in your head. But for some reason we sing about I love you, I can't live without you, while Indigenous cultures sing their knowledge. Now, we teach little kids their ABCs and singing their knowledge, and then we stop. Why? Why aren't we singing knowledge right through our entire lives? There's a lot of research that shows that music and place, the 2 things that are so big in Indigenous cultures, country in Australian terms, are stored deepest in the hippocampus. And the neuroscience of memory is so strong in terms of what Indigenous cultures are doing. People with advanced dementia that are almost unresponsive otherwise will respond to music, familiar music, and to familiar places. So why aren't we singing information for our entire lives rather than pop songs? That's my hobby horse is to get art and music into the heart of the curriculum. May I say here, I was a physics and maths teacher. I'm not, pushing my own barrow here. So the Pueblo, we're back to corn. The Pueblo used the mythology of the corn mothers, who are danced and sung, and the stories told, the teachings told constantly. So there's the two corn mothers and the corn maidens, who are the different colours, yellow, white, red, black, blue. And there's the mixed, the one that's the cross-pollinated one. And these stories tell you about these different corn. Now, if they planted all the lovely sweet yellow corn every year in the harsh climate there, and they had a drought, boom, they just wiped out the entire population. A lesson that permaculture is trying to teach about: do not have vast areas of monocultures. They don't. So they tell the stories and they perform them. And they don't have gods. They have characters whose stories they tell. I got that expression from the Pueblo, from indigenous Australian, from everywhere. So Australians call them the ancestors or the old people. In the Pueblo, they're called the Kachina. And so when children are young, they're given little dolls. This is a tourist one. I've got photographs of the real ones from museums, but they're given little dolls of each of the characters, and there's a couple of nearly 200 and something active Kachina. They vary the number because they bring them in and out depending on what's important. These cultures are dynamic. Those stories give you the basic characters, like the corn mothers and the corn children and thousands more. They are still going, and contemporary artists, Pueblo artists, are still creating these characters. That's actually the son. I haven't got a corn one, but that tell the stories. So they perform. I'll just show you one more. This is one of their characters, is the storyteller. Everyone in archaeology, if you ever get a woman, it's always a fertility. Actually, indigenous cultures are a little more complex than that. They don't only think about sex and having babies. So this one would be interpreted as a fertility symbol, but in fact, she's a storyteller. And the stories are told to the children. So the stories are told as fables, and those are all we hear because we're not initiated. And that lays down all the information about the corn. Then higher and higher into initiation, the information is kept more and more restricted, because by restricting information, it keeps it accurate. It stops what we in Australia, for some stupid reason, call the Chinese whispers effect. In America, it's called the telephone effect or something. But that information's corrupted. And we have knowledge in Australia of stories that have been scientifically verified, not that the Aboriginal people needed that, that date back at least 17,000 years. And my work and research on Stonehenge and so on, that's only 5,000 years ago, a mere baby.
Wow.
So that's how accurate these stories are. So as they get higher and higher in the Pueblo, they will store within the stories of the corn maidens and the corn mothers how to select the best kernels for storage, how to plant separated by time and space. So who in they use the term Pueblo for the village as well. Who in the Pueblo will plant what, where, and when, and what they'll put between. And they use the three corn. How can I forget the three that were beans and
sisters?
Three sisters, yes.
Corn, beans, and squash.
Squash, that's right. I was thinking of zucchini. Anyway, to act as guards to reduce cross-pollination. They've got all these rules and regulations that are encoded in the mythology, performed in restricted locations called kiva, K-I-V-A, by masking up and impersonating is the term they use, the Kachina. So mythology is a practical device to store information. As to the level of spirituality or not, that's not for me to judge. You can only judge that from within a culture. But this is all written about by Alfonso Ortiz, who's a Pueblo writer, who writes about it in terms of the stories and so on. And then he tells you to also read Richard I. Ford, who's an ethnobotanist, who writes about it from the scientific purpose point of view. And if you read the two, they don't seem to overlap until you read the two together. It is two totally different ways of storing the same information, and both are pragmatic.
Wow, it's the like ultimate integration really of the arts and the sciences, which we seem to have lost. In your
Absolutely.
book, in the memory code, you give an example of how you encoded the plants in your garden using a 16 calorie divining method. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's both a success and a failure. I do a lot of experiments. It's a success in that it showed that the Yoruba people of West Africa who use the 16 calorie method, which I'll explain, use it for masses of information. It failed for me. It was too complicated and I couldn't work it out. So what they do is they take 16 calories and they toss them.
For those at home, the cowrie is
a cowrie shell that's got the sort of little curly bits on one side and smooth on the other. And they toss them, and depending on how many turn up face up and how many are face down, that tells them which story they're to tell. And so that gives you encoding of 17, because you can have them all up, all down, gives you 17 different. And then they toss them again. And that gives you hundreds of different stories of, if there were 14 up in the first one and then 7 up in the second one, that's a particular set of stories. Wow. So I tried to do that for 16 different plants and then another 16 characteristics of them. So for example, I've got 2 species pelargoniums out there, Pelargonium pseudoides and Pelargonium reniforme. And so I had associated those with different turn-ups of tossing the cowries. And I just found it too difficult. I just couldn't make it work. There's a hierarchy to it and then stories associated, again, back to mythology. For the Yoruba people, there is one book that's 300 pages of the verses sung by one elder.
Wow.
And I've got somewhere written here over 1,200 verses, all encoding information, all from tossing this. Now, the Highland Maya do the same sort of thing, but they use seeds, and there's other cultures do it. Now, Aboriginal people use stones and various layouts to tell stories. I've tried it that way, copying the Australian indigenous way of telling stories using stones, and that worked a treat. I've done the Greek mythology that way because I chose stones and things, shells and that were different. But I really struggled. So the Yoruba people are brilliant. I now, for memorizing my pseudoides and reniforme and pelargonium and so on, use the garden acts as a memory palace anyway, and we need to explain songlines and memory palaces. And then I use just story. So Pelargonium pseudoides is about Sid, who's a guy that came from South Africa and tested out the properties of this plant and couldn't tell apart that until a little wren came along and told him about reniforme, which looks the same except the flowers are slightly different colours and how it had different properties. So I'm using the locations and the stories, or the teachings, as Jarrah would prefer we say, and that works fine for me. The Yoruba are far too clever for me.
Well, you have, I love that you've experimented so, intricately with so many different techniques, and you really go into a lot of detail in the book. One of the techniques that I was just fascinated by was doing the singing or the story walk around your neighborhood to encode the history and the sort of calendar of events into the landscape, which obviously is is taken from, inspired by Australian Indigenous kind of songlines. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how you managed to encode so much information in just a walk around your street?
Yes. I am constantly shocked by how well these techniques work. Because remember, this is the person who failed languages at school because I couldn't remember anything. I'm now doing French and then decided I'd take on Chinese as well. So I'm doing Mandarin and remembering lots of vocab. These methods are incredible, but they match the neuroscience, so it's no surprise. So a songline effectively is a set of locations in the landscape in order that you walk, and at each location a ritual is performed. Now, a ritual is a repeated event. You can't read anything more into it than that. So it could be a story or an act or whatever. So at each location, so I encoded around my neighborhood. I've now got 10 kilometers of Castlemaine. In fact, I did my French verbs this morning. I happened to be up early, which is unusual. So I whacked around my French ER verbs this morning. So let's take the French ER verb. Oh no, the history one. History's that way. I'm pointing at my song lines. Prehistory's that way. So I take around the block for history, starting at 1000 BC at my front gate, and I go down to 0 at the corner, 500, 1000, 1500, 800, back home to the current. And then the last century goes right around the house every single year. And by setting that out, if I want to encode something, so if I whack over to in my mind, I don't have to physically walk it over to Randall's Road, I know I'm at 1200. If I look around me, I can see that Great Zimbabwe is happening down in Africa, in Zimbabwe. King John's on the throne, and there's Robin Hood behind that bush over there. The Song Dynasty over in China, the Pueblo are doing their stuff in Chaco Canyon. And so I've got all this stuff happening, but I don't have to remember the dates. I can encode the actual dates using another method, but I just have to stand in the landscape and look around me. I can see what's behind, what's coming up. I've got a big picture, and that's what I think our education's losing. I think we've departmentalized everything so much. And I think farming's done this to an extreme where we farm this breed of sheep rather than the permaculture approach of locally bringing in the whole environment. And so that's what I've found is I notice things. I associate things with every house and every wall and everything. And when I want to put something new in, I just go to that location and make up a story. It's great fun. I get exercise, but I'm noticing details. And so up at Kalimna, I'm in Castlemaine, up at Kalimna, I've done a couple of songlines with my husband, Damien, who's really into permaculture and birding and all this sort of stuff. And it's interesting that I've named the walk, there's a couple of kilometres we've done, according to what's there, the way Indigenous people do. Not according to my friends, and Randall's Road's named after some guy. It doesn't tell me anything. So your brain just jumps to all these places, has gone to Yellow-Faced Honeyeater Gully, where for some reason we always hear, at least, if not see, yellow-faced honeyeaters, whereas in other locations we don't. And we've started noticing these details because we've got names to hook things onto. And that's what Indigenous cultures do with their songlines. The contemporary term is memory palace. It's the same thing. Mm. And if you look up memory palace, you'll find it was invented by the Greeks, which is rubbish. Native Americans with their pilgrimage trails, Pacific Islanders with their ceremonial roads, and obviously our songlines date back way, way before the ancient Greeks. They've done a simplified version, and it's used by all memory champions today because there is no better method.
It sounds like a great way to reanimate the world as well. And, just hearing about all your characters and stories and songs. I mean, going for a walk is nice enough, but having all of these images kind of just pop out of the landscape must make it so much more enjoyable as well.
Oh, it's wonderful, except sometimes I just want to go down the shops. And I have to say, and St. Augustine has written a passage, because he used these methods, about how everything jumps out of you and you've got to say no to everything and just select what you want. And sometimes I walk down the street and just say, no, hang on, no, I'm just walking down the street.
It's like going in a small town and telling your friends, I haven't got time, I've just got to pick something.
Exactly. But St. Augustine himself, probably because he talked about, who's at a lamppost just down the road there, always jumps out. He will not listen to me and he has to chat to me every time because he says I'm wasting walks if I'm not engaging. But I've been doing this for now about 10 years and this landscape is so precious to me. I can't move house. We're stuck here forever. Can you imagine what it's like for Indigenous people who know that for forever this landscape has had this dynamic life? It's being added to constantly. They've been brought up with it all their lives, and their parents and their grandparents and auntie and uncle, everyone's talked this. It must be unbelievably evocative. And then in come the, I don't want to say invaders, the colonizers, invaders, put a fence across and say, you're not allowed there. I mean, the physical cruelty was horrific. The emotional and intellectual cruelty was also horrific. And in the Native Americans, the reason I work with the Pueblo is that they stayed on their own land. The others were moved to reservations and told, hey, this land's good, what are you complaining about? And they called it the Walk of Tears because they were taken off their memory palaces, off their songlines. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I don't think we can even begin to imagine, you know, because we're so distanced from that side of our own culture that, you know, after reading Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, and I just read The Memory Code, I just, you know, had this moment of thinking, wow, you know, that, like you say, that the physical atrocities are one thing, but the cultural amnesia that was imposed, and, you know, it's kind of like giving mass dementia to a culture where you're forced to people to forget, and we don't even have a reference point for how traumatic that must have been.
No.
And you know, so in bringing back these techniques through your work and through, you know, through connecting with cultures that still have them, I guess the intention is not so much, you know, a form of cultural appropriation, but a way for us to reconnect to that pattern within our own culture, because we all have, you know, at some point in history, we have a connection to this as well, but in a way to connect back to the land so that we can live more sustainably, right?
Absolutely. I was concerned, obviously, with the cultural, I can't say the word today, appropriation or misappropriation, as is so often done, especially with New Age people that take the spirit of Native Americans as if they're all the same. I mean, they've got umpteen cultures too. But I was very concerned about that. But I found the easiest thing to say is use the word glimpse and say to Aboriginal people, I am glimpsing what is appropriate for me to say and what isn't. So the techniques, to emphasize the memory techniques themselves and these methods, has been hugely welcomed by the Aboriginal Indigenous people all over Australia. In fact, I've just been invited, we've just completed a new book called Songlines, The Power and Promise, coming out with Thames and Hudson in October, with Margot Neal, who's the head of the Indigenous Knowledges Centre at National Museum of Australia, to be invited by a leading Indigenous identity to co-author on Songlines. It's called The Power and the Promise because she understands the power. I can only glimpse it. But the promise to us of a new way of looking at the environment, of when you start putting out a songline, you start noticing stuff that you would never have noticed before because you don't dash past. You start engaging with it. So it offers us so much, but we don't have to give up anything. And Margot talks about three archives. The first archive is the indigenous methods using song, dance, story, art, music, obviously, hugely, and the landscape, and engaging with the plants and animals as equals, not as in some way to be exploited. The Western archive with technology and writing and so on. And then a third archive, which is what the National Museum did with their Songlines exhibitions on, is taking the two and melding them. And the third archive is far more powerful because it uses everything we've got. So why in schools and why in our life aren't we adding in landscape, song, dance, story, mythology, and writing and technology, and whacking the lot together and using the best method for each appropriate. So I wouldn't suggest 16 calorie method in schools, but I would suggest the Lukasa, because we've been testing it and we haven't mentioned the Lukasa yet, but we'll get to it. Portable memory devices. So, because those are used everywhere, and they were key to me looking at Stonehenge and other monuments right around the world and showing that they were actually memory songlines, localized songlines, because they all use portable memory devices as well.
Yeah, interesting you bring that up. One quote I liked in your book was that these memory systems have allowed people in non-literate cultures, as in like oral cultures and people without writing, to memorize huge amounts of practical information they needed to survive. And being a school teacher once upon a time, I was going to ask how you think this could be used in societies today, or particularly, where literacy rates are lower in schools. And it's interesting you bring up the Lukasa, because that was one of the most intriguing photos I saw. In fact, I made a link between sort of the modern day memory device, the old tablet that we swipe around, and the Lukasa is kind of similar in a way, isn't it? Can you describe exactly what it is?
Yes, I'll start with the Aboriginal version. All cultures use portable memory devices. And so that's a coolamont, a food dish. But on the back of lots of them, there are symbols. I can't see my own thing now, and those symbols are encoded. So this one is from the Western Desert, over 100 years old, and I was given custodianship of it. And the sad thing is the knowledge is lost because that particular culture no longer exists or uses these traditions, which is heartbreaking. But each of those little markings, the girl, I wouldn't have been given anything that would have been a male object, would be taught the song associated. So I've encoded habitats and things. So I've used that for marine habitats and that for mountain habitats. And then you start singing songs and doing the stories, the teachings associated with it. And that is phenomenally effective. Now, when I first heard of these, the first time I read about it was about the African Lukasa of the Luba people. This is a model of one. There are none in Australia, and I didn't see one till about 3 years ago in America in a museum, and held it, which was unbelievably emotional. I'll come back, and this has been designed for my own knowledge, which works unbelievably well. But when I read about that they encoded entire history and all sorts of masses to a bit of wood with beads and shells nailed on and some carvings and tortoiseshell carving, and they use the back as well, I thought, well, look, I'm actually a foundation member of the Australian Skeptics. I just don't believe that's possible. But being a good scientist, I did a really detailed experiment. I grabbed a bit of wood they were building our veranda at the time, grabbed a bit of wood, shoved on some beads and shells in no particular order, didn't even know what I was going to do with it. That's how slack I was. And because Damien, my husband's a well-known birder, wrote Castlemaine Bird Walks, if you want local bird walks around here. Anyway, I decided to encode the Victorian birds to it, 412 of them. Just checking I've got it the right way up. So there's 82 families, starting with the emu, the anatidae, the ducks, and so on, and then the stories. And I was shocked how well this worked. So the emu's there, but there's anatidae, the ducks. I don't know if you can see that bead. It's got a tiny little speck on it, and that's a ducktail wagging. Once the pareidoia, you know that stuff? You know, where you see patterns in clouds and patterns and things. I can't look at that and not see a ducktail wagging. So I know, and that duck's wagging because it's got a gnat on it. So that gives me a gnat a day. And then I've got 16 of them, but that includes the swans and the magpie goose. So it's a footy match between the swans and the magpies, and it gets out of control. The hard head bashes everyone.
400 and what species of birds?
412 species of birds.
And how many beads are on? There's not 412 beads on.
There's 82 families.
So that must be some pretty multi-layered encoding going on there.
That's right. That's what I'm doing with the Anatidae. There's 16 ducks on that bead.
Wow.
And it's the story between the magpies and the swans, and it gets out of hand, which is why you've got a hard head bashing everybody. The Australian shoveler is burying the dead. The musk duck's wearing his musk cologne, is off in the bushes having sex. And stories you need, unfortunately, the human brain, I hate to confess, sex and violence does make stories more memorable. And vulgarity.
A lot about
and that's
history.
why mythology, they're extremely beautiful or extremely ugly or extremely violent, because that makes it memorable. I have those. I don't need this with me. And when we go bush, I use a memory technique to memorize our bird lists, but I know every family, and now I'm layering it. And that gets back to exactly what Indigenous cultures do. They put down this layer with the children's stories and then layer information. So teachers get upset saying this is rote learning. It's not rote learning at all. It's grounding your information firmly and then layering higher and higher levels. So you'll find the Indigenous cultures talk philosophy and debate and all the higher levels of learning, but they ground it first. And we, Paul Allen and Alice Steele, two people here in Castlemaine, have run workshops with kids. Alice had her son at 3 with a smaller version of this, doing all the local acacias. And you should have seen him doing his acacia,
Wow. It seems like,
it just works.
I don't know much about coding or technology. The IT nerds out there might be interested in this analogy of, I'm picturing sort of a circuit board. Like what you're doing in there is kind of tracing a circuit, really, drawing a pattern around the beads, and that evokes a program or something, such thing in your head. Whereas like in this, all the coding is within this, but on the Lukasa, it actually is up here. And that's right. or in the landscape or wherever, it's a way more resilient form of storing memory, isn't it?
Absolutely. And by the cultural things of keeping things accurate, it's stored in more than one person. You never have a single person in control. That comes later with violence and money control.
Yeah.
But my background is IT, and this is actually an IT theory. Basically, for any geeks on board, I am saying that all of these are memory spaces, exactly as in memory. So database structures, they're variable length databases in that you can encode more and more and more into each location. And the only trouble is the data is here, nowhere else. So it is exactly the same structurally, and the encoding is, the instructions are stored in the songs.
And,
so, yes,
no rare earth minerals required, or, it's low paid wages.
And it's way more fun making up stories.
Mm.
And of course, Indigenous cultures, they have the stories handed down, but they're not unaltered. They will change them with new information. They'll elaborate on them. They'll perform them differently. The core information is usually kept the same. And the stuff we know from Patrick Nunn's book, The Edge of Memory, and his research, he's a geographer, shows stories that go back 17,000 years, and we're expecting they'll go back way more with more. And Dwayne Hummaker's ones with the astronomy is because this stars, skyscape, and the landscape are the fundamental memory structures. And that's why those stories are the most robust. So there's stories from right around Australia of the landscape changes when the islands were connected, what's underneath Port Phillip Bay. All these things are recorded, and there's, you know, volcanic eruptions and craters formed by meteorites. And what Patrick shows is that there are craters and volcanoes that predate Aboriginal here 200,000 years ago, and there are no stories about them. Those that are, when we know the cultures were here, there are stories about. So there's very clear, robust evidence that these stories are being stored over these vast amounts of time using this combination. So I've done spiders. If I got it up the right way, spiders are my big thing. I'm always wearing a spider, love them. Wrote a book on spiders because I adore them. I used to be petrified of them, but knowledge cures irrational fears. And so I made a memory board of the spiders with their eye patterns, because that's how you tell the families of each of the spider families, and some down there. Aranidae is the big one, so I did more bits. And there's a wolf spider over there. Wolf. So doing this, it's not as effective as that because I haven't got the tactile as much, but it still works, and it works well. And this is easy to do in schools, because if you go to your local op shop and ask them for any of the jewellery that's broken, you buy that. That's where I get all my beads. I've got tons of them here because I happen to volunteer at the Animal Welfare op shop, and they keep all the broken jewellery for me, and I pay, you know, $5 for a bag of the stuff. And that gives you all the beads and shells and pretty things you need to make these devices.
It's great. It's
Why
like
aren't we doing it in
the
schools?
next step of those, you know, those macaroni stick-on things you do in kindergarten. You could just take it the next step.
Yeah, and you can use macaroni for it if you like.
Yeah.
All you're doing is encoding. So if you take all your permaculture information and encode it, but I sing that too. I've got a song, I sing it in the shower, full volume. I've got it the right way. It really matters to me that it's up the right way. I am so emotionally attached to this. It's unbelievable. The house burns down, I'll grab the husband and little Akasa. But I sing it. And when I get to there, I've got to the cockatoos where I belt out kaka, 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 chew day trying to imitate them. And my granddaughter, Leah, when she was littler, would sing it, but she'd just go, yeah, day, and then belt out the kakakakachua day. She didn't care what she was singing. She just liked making the noise and the rhythm and doing what grandma was doing. And that's what you'll find in Indigenous cultures. The kids will sing the songs, but they may not necessarily know all the meanings. They will be granted those meanings as they get initiated higher to ensure that information is kept accurate. It's just wonderful. And all we need to do is add music and art and imagination, sing our science, make music of our mathematics, you know.
Totally. Here's a test of your memory. Bill Mollison, the co-originator of permaculture, ran a permaculture workshop at your place when you lived near Ballarat years ago.
It was a while ago, right at the beginning. And Bill came, and we had a small property and we were trying to head for self-sufficiency. He came and showed planting and how to lay it out, and also chatted to our daughter. He planted a lemon tree, and we had sort of the veggie garden over there, the orchard, you know, and he sort of said, yeah, and this is the play area. Why? You know, so that made us rethink, and what we've got here is much more on permaculture lines.
I never got to meet Bill, but I saw him on his show Global Gardener on the ABC a few years ago, and one thing I remember was on one of his visits to Africa where he interviews some farmers who talk about how singing is an integral part of the workday and is, you know, done collectively, just as a standard practice, which was actually one of the inspirations behind my first album, which was called Permaculture, a Rhymer's Manual, because I was just intrigued by this idea that we could encode information using songs. And as a musician, I'd never thought of that before. It's just like music is just for dancing to and having fun at the pub. But, you know, of course, we've kind of lost that connection in our culture.
But we don't need to reintroduce that in schools.
Yeah.
All we've got to do is get the music and art teachers on board, and every other teacher
And
to
the science
understand.
teachers and the English, yeah.
All the rest need to realise these are not peripheral subjects. They're
Mm.
not the subjects you take the kids out of because it doesn't matter if they miss that, but does matter if they miss maths or English or science. They are integral. So at Malmesbury Primary School, Paul Allen had the kids make kachina. Or we didn't call them kachina because that would be cultural misappropriation, to put it mildly. And we decided we want to call them something, so we called them cheekies. Except we then Googled cheekies and got a lot of bottoms, so we changed the name. And Paul came up with the idea of rapscallions. And the students made their rapscallions in art and gave them personalities, and then used them to maths tables to tell the stories of, 6 8s are 48, that's sticks and gate and naughty gate. And they would use each other's and they acted out the order of the planets and all sorts of things. And they were so emotionally attached to these characters that they'd created in art. Then they drew their stories, they wrote their story. Their knowledge came to life using music and art, but they were still doing maths and science and all the rest.
Mm.
So
and I imagine that the knowledge is strengthened by doing it collectively too. I mean, you've
Exactly.
mentioned characters and rituals, but I imagine doing this as a group or, as a village or as a community creates these stronger shared memes for memorizing things. That's something I've been really intrigued by. And I'm wondering if you have any other tidbits of like the patterns that we need to kind of use to create these shared cultural memes for information that's going to be, potentially essential to our survival in the future.
Oh, there's so many by using these devices, and they don't have to be started by children. Anyone can do them. But you'll notice in indigenous cultures, there's not normally in the early ones that are still in their non-literate. Non-literate is talking about what they don't have. They don't have literacy. The alternative is orality, and that's my academic field of research. Orality, orality, is all these methods used to store information. There isn't a single chief of an Aboriginal group. It's a shared leader group of elders. The Pueblo have a chief, but it changes. Never more than 6 months, and no chief has control of all the information, because my PhD was titled When Knowledge Was Power, because control of the information is the source of power. And what's happened since then, when we've got individuals arise, and in the archaeology you get the wealthy grave goods and individual burials, is when the culture gets bigger. And then you get single chiefs, and power goes to wealth and violence. And it changes from knowledge. And then the knowledge elite become the druids and so on, keeping the information for the leaders, but wealth and violence takes over. I think there is a massive lesson there about power linked to wealth and violence rather than linked to knowledge. And I believe the solution to this world is that we must hand power back to the knowledge experts. And if you look at this pandemic, who's following what the scientists and the public health experts who do not have a single leader and who do not have huge wealth or violence, they are serving the leaders who use wealth and violence, I believe, as their method of maintaining control. And you can see around the world, those that are listening to the knowledge elite, as that's what I used to call them, when the elite was all about knowledge, and those who are taking leadership from those who are there because of wealth.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done to kind of get back to something a bit more sustainable, for want of a better word.
Well, for the climate, but also the more we can bring back to permaculture type thinking, not just the growing, but the thinking of the integrated nature. And that's what Indigenous cultures do. They don't separate their information, the integrated nature of life, culture, community, everything. And we can do it. We don't have to give up anything except extreme wealth and violence.
Maybe a bit of humility chucked in there for good measure.
Oh.
You're currently working on your new book you mentioned called Songlines, The Power and Promise with Professor Margot Neal, who is, as you mentioned, the head of the new Centre for Indigenous Knowledge, Senior Indigenous Curator and Principal Advisor to the Director at the National Museum of Australia.
Wow.
Sounds very exciting. Can you just remind us when it's going to be out, and can you tell us any more about it at this stage?
It's at the end of October. If you Google Songlines, The Power and Promise, you'll find Thames and Hudson have linked it. It originated because Margot, it's actually the lead book of a series on First Nations knowledges, and Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage are writing one, and there's some on astronomy and architecture and other stuff coming out over the next couple of years. But it's a series of books to try and put Indigenous knowledges, and they're getting an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous person writing together to try and get the perspectives and to try and say, hey, one of the early reviews of it described it as an act of intellectual reconciliation. And I was wrapped in that because what Margot's doing in the National Museum in leading this is trying to say, we don't need to battle. We don't need to have Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We can mesh together as long as we're willing to do so. So Margot curated the hugely successful exhibition Songlines, which Aboriginal people used Western methods of video and writing, but also art and music and song, to explain the Seven Sisters Songlines. It goes right across Australia and all the knowledge stored with it. It was so successful that this series of books was proposed. Margot invited me to co-author with her, which was massively complimentary. I'm still a little shocked it happened, but it's a validation of my work because I don't try to tell the stories or be Indigenous, because I can't be, but I can learn from. And that's what I really think our curriculum that says we should learn about Indigenous cultures, no, we should learn from. They are equal. Their knowledge systems are just as valuable, and we can work together. So it's out October 27th, but the first reviews are already in and they're really, really good.
I can't wait. Thanks so much, Lynne. Is there anything else? The book is Memory Craft for anyone who's interested. That's a practical guide to how to do this stuff. Look, I've magically just got a copy here.
Right, that's Memory Craft. That's the practical how to do. Memory Code is the research on the Indigenous and why it works for archaeology. There is the horrendously expensive do not buy unless you like sentences with lots of brackets and names in it. But Cambridge University Press published my thesis with why this explains why, when they're looking at Stonehenge and Easter Island and everything, do they always assume that Indigenous people lived in a fog of superstition? And the whole archaeology of the ditches and the Stonehenge plaques, which work like that, but also right around the world. So that's the academic. So my stuff's been reviewed and checked, and I haven't had a negative reaction. I'm not saying any of the current theories about these ancient monuments are wrong. I'm saying that they are all part of the big picture, and that Indigenous cultures are big picture people. And that's why permaculture is so important, because it's a big picture way of doing things, not, little tiny bits in isolation.
Yeah, it's very complimentary. Lynne, thanks so much for all of the work you've been doing. I think I'm really grateful to have discovered it and, been able to use it in my work. Thanks so much for having a chat with us through Permaculture Australia, and all the best with the new book.
Thank you. It's been fun talking to you.
It has. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I wonder if I could share a song.
Please do.
This one it's about the permaculture principle, observe and interact, which I think ties in pretty well with this conversation. Everything you need is right in front of you, when you learn to see. Good things come to you. All you have to do is stop and take a look around before you intervene. Don't do anything. Yeah, come to all your senses. They'll tell you everything. First you have to learn to stop and take a look around. Oh yeah, now and take a look. Read your landscape like a book. Interact, low impact, and get your feedback when you take a look around. Well, abundance will abound, because the problem is the solution. Just depends on your perception. Gotta change yourself before you change the world. Well, now take a look around, from the inside to the out. Because when you observe yourself, you see everything else. Make good use of it now. There you go.
Lovely. And the sentiments expressed are exactly right.
Brilliant. Oh, thanks so much, Lynn. I hope to catch you in real life soon. For everyone watching, make sure to check out the books, Memory Craft and The Memory Code. And if you enjoy songs about permaculture, you can check out Formidable Vegetable too. But take care, and we'll hopefully chat soon.
Okay, thanks.
Take a look around. Get your hands into the ground.